I'm so happy to be here.
I'm delighted to be here with you.
You've fascinated me pretty much all my life. You've been a very large figure, unbeknownst to you, in my psyche. And I'm so glad to get to hear some of your stories and share them with the listeners. I think that your overseas experience is so unusual, and the imprinting that these countries have had on your psyche will hopefully show up during this interview, because you've been probably to more countries than any human I've ever known. You're conversant in more languages than anyone I've ever known. So let's just get started with the fact that you got into overseas work to begin with. How did that even happen?
As I was graduating from undergraduate, the U.S. government was drafting everybody they could find to go to Vietnam. And I didn't agree with that war. So I joined the Peace Corps, which at that point provided a deferment, not an excuse, but a deferment. And I went off to Gabon for 2 years to build schools and not be drafted.
And was that your first time stepping foot outside of the country?
Unless you count a trip to Bermuda to play rugby when I was an undergraduate, yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't count that. So coming from the East Coast to Gabon in the 60s, I'm guessing, late 60s?
65, yeah.
65 must have been just shocking in certain ways. What was it like when you initially entered the country?
It was at the end of a very long and somewhat alcoholic flight on the Red Eye Special. I used to go across Africa. And I think there were about 40 of us, all men, mostly hungover, and just eager to get someplace where we could stretch out and lie down. We were greeted by the Minister of Education. We were there to build schools. And I had been designated as the official greeter since my French was a little better than most people. And I managed to say, instead of saying, "Good evening, Mr. Minister," I said, "Good Minister, Mr. Evening." Bon ministre, monsieur le soir. That got a laugh out of everybody, and also went to the hotel to get some rest. But it was quite overwhelming.
Can you tell me, I mean, I'm remembering the first time I visited certain countries like Japan or China for that matter, and feeling just overwhelmed. I notice visions and, of course, smells. My senses were just on fire. Was that true for you in Gabon when you were first there?
Yeah, of course. So you're noticing things, noticing the people, noticing the scenery. Libreville, the capital, is at that point was a very sleepy tropical town. This is before Gabon discovered oil, so it was not very active. And we walked around quite a lot, and it was hot and smelled of bananas and of people. And it was striking, yes, of course. And it also helped that because we had learned French before we left, or at least I had, was able to speak to people and listen to people right from the start.
Fantastic. And you caught the bug, it sounds like, very early on to live overseas. Is that consistent with your experience?
The way things worked out, when I finished up in Gabon, I came back to graduate school. And during my year in graduate school, the Army tried to draft me because I had not yet reached the non-draftable age. I graduated, I went to Peace Corps at 21, came back at 23. And you could be drafted until you were 26, if you remember this. And this was before the era of quota numbers, where you could be excused if you had a high enough number. So they tried to draft me again. And the Peace Corps was no longer an option to be deferred from the draft. So I joined a different group called International Voluntary Services and went to Laos for 2 years. And thus had my first-hand experience of the Indochina War while more or less on the Hearts and Minds campaign in northern Laos. Over.
So by not going to the war, you actually stepped into the place that was shelled almost the most by U.S. bombing, I believe. Is that correct?
Not the actual place I was, but yes, the country. Yes, that's right.
Did
The
you?
city we lived in, I was there with my first wife, and who I think I'm not sure you met, Catherine.
I never met.
She and I lived in Luang Prabang, which was bombed half a dozen times by the Pathalao when we were there, and I would go out to villages where I would go during the daytime, and the Pathalao would come in at night, and we had an understanding that we'd leave each other alone. And it was an interesting time.
I imagine it was at times frightening.
I'm sure it was. I have blanked all that out, of course.
Okay. Well, I'm going to be bringing up fear a little bit more. You went there with your first wife, Catherine. Was she from the U.S. or was she from?
Yeah, she was from the U.S. I met her in the Peace Corps.
Got it. And the Peace Corps was in its nascent phase. It was probably just trying to figure out who it was, and you were part of that.
By the time I joined in '65, I really felt I had missed the first wave. It was the first volunteers went, I think, in '61 or '62. And I met a couple of them afterwards, and they felt like the originators. I felt like someone who was treading in well-worn footsteps by the time I went.
And I know that you really have a profound desire to make things better in the world. And I'm guessing that instead of being conscripted and going against your code, you felt like you were building something over there. What were you building, and what was it like for you in terms of your felt sense of the work you were doing, the meaning?
Well, it was hard to imagine an end to the war that would have been positive for Laos either way. But I was assigned to a teacher training college and was supposed to train future teachers on how to do community development in the towns to which they were assigned once they graduated. So I would organize groups of them to go out to the villages and work with the villagers to build a little school or dig a well or rehab an irrigation system or do whatever we could do to try to make life a little better for the people who were visiting, who were the people whom my students would afterwards be assigned to teach. So you bury yourself in the small bits of good you could do as you went along, and tried not to think too much about the way things were going overall, except when the U.S. government bigwigs would come to visit, and we would argue with them about the relative virtue of teaching versus bombing.
And what were you teaching?
Teaching them how to do community development. I also taught geography and history.
And when you say community development, you mean building buildings that will support the community itself?
Helping to work with villagers to develop their mutual assistance structures so that they could combine their resources to try to generate a better life for themselves. Short term, that meant building things. Longer term, it meant helping develop governance structures and whatever else you could do to make sure they were all talking to each other and working with each other to make sure that they had the best possible chance to get the most from the resources they had at their disposal.
Wow. Right. So, boy, that what could be more important than that? Did you see the net gains of the communities based on the work that you and your team was doing?
Only in the short term. You know, they were better off for having a well or a school or a little dispensary, but we were unable to maintain sufficient duration of contact, and I was only there 2 years, so this is the kind of thing that takes many more years.
Sure. And during your 2 years, you learned how to speak Lao. And so I'm imagining you what the listener cannot see is Max is a very large man and played football in college and I would imagine quite well at that. And I'm just imagining you walking through kind of uncharted territories in Laos, and with your height and your Caucasian-ish looks, speaking Lao, what was that? How were you received out there?
When I would go to villages in the dark after I had learned Lao and talk, people would not immediately know that I was a foreigner, which was very flattering. But after a short while, my shortcomings in the language, I got to be pretty good at it, but not native fluent, of course. I never felt personal animosity from anyone in Laos.
I imagine
the question.
That actually isn't the question. I wasn't imagining animosity. I was imagining kind of the novelty of seeing this tall Westerner who speaking Lao. It would be somewhat novel or surprising, or certainly unprecedented for many of the people out in these remote villages.
The Lao were a French colony for many years, and the Americans began coming in quite early in the Vietnam War era. And there were a lot of them around, a lot of Americans around, a lot of us. And many of the villages I went to did not tend to see other Westerners, but in the town where I lived in Luang Prabang, there were lots. And you'd see them in the restaurants, in the movies, in the shops, at the markets. And we would be taken for granted. There were enough big Western people around, so it wasn't that unique.
Oh, okay. Very different from my imagination of your reality at that time.
That was more true in Gabon. There were the villages that we went to had very few large Westerners.
And how were you received there?
In a very friendly way. Always very friendly.
Yeah.
Speaking the language helps a lot, and means you can listen to people, and that's the most important thing.
So, Max, in the course of your life, I've been told that you have been able to speak 18 languages, approximately.
No, that's an exaggeration.
Okay. How many is it approximately?
That I was able to speak fluently while I was there, maybe 10. But
okay.
A number of them are what they used to call anthropological languages, which means they're spoken by a relatively small group of people in a very circumscribed part of the world. And thus, after you leave, there is no way to practice, and they disappear very quickly. So there's a much smaller set that I can still use to some extent.
So one of the things that we have in common, although at a much smaller scale for me, is that when I've spent extended periods of time in a country, I've made it my duty to learn the language. And learning a language is cognitively a heavy challenge. I'm wondering, did you have any techniques that allowed you to become more proficient quicker?
Nothing that I could describe, just keeping at it. Which languages have you learned in?
Japanese, Spanish, and a little bit of Italian.
Japanese is impressive. I tried to learn Japanese once and failed completely.
Most people do. It was interesting when I was studying it at Pomona College. I was on the Claremont School campus. 120 of us started, and at the end of 2 years, there were 12. So a lot of people start Japanese, but very few people stick with it. It's hard. But I found that similar to you, that the mistakes that I made along the way, like saying "Good Mr. Evening," was actually generally endearing. They saw the effort, and for me, my tip was I was willing to look stupid for a while. That I recognized that was a necessary phase in language learning. Is that consistent with yours?
Completely, yes. You have to be willing to look stupid, not just about language, but about almost everything when you're learning a new country and a new culture.
Totally. Can you describe any other times when you really stepped in it?
And language?
Language, or even just culturally, where you just completely did a 180 of what should have been done by a local?
Not really. I mean, not. I'm sure there were plenty, but I blanked them all.
Okay, fair enough.
But I do remember when I was in Egypt, I had learned to speak Egyptian street Arabic pretty well.
Wow.
And was occasionally called upon to give a speech to a group of people who didn't speak very, very good English. So I would try to give it in Egyptian Arabic, and they could all understand it because they're all Egyptians, of course. But when I tried to write something on the board, people would not have any idea what I had written until I read it out to them, because they weren't used to reading Egyptian Arabic. When they read, they expected to read modern standard Arabic, like what's in a newspaper.
Makes sense.
And they had no idea that people could actually write Egyptian Arabic, although novelists certainly do these days. But it took a moment and a lot of laughter to get that straightened out. But once they saw what I was writing, they were able to follow easily.
That's fabulous. One of the things that I take delight in visiting countries is I change after each visit. Something changes in me just based on seeing the way things are held culturally, or so with regard to society. How has your travels changed you?
You'd have to ask my children, I think. I'm not sure. I used to, when I was much, much younger, I had a little bit of a fierce temper. And I learned that was not a productive trait. And I've been able to control it a lot more. The only thing recently that's been able to get my temper up has been struggling to get onto Medicare when I turned 65. But that's been something that I've learned that you really have to control if you're going to be at all useful working overseas.
Mm. And was that the byproduct of just trying to adapt overseas, or was there something instructional about a particular culture in channeling anger?
No, it's just a question of generally being wise about how you treat people and listening to them before you mouth off about something.
That's a lot easier said than done. That's a really important skill. And it sounds like I'm guessing that your ability to listen by being a newbie in so many places has been really enhanced.
Well, doing development, as you said at the beginning of this interview, is trying to make things better. You're supposed to leave things better than they were when you got there. And you can't do that if you're pissing people off, as it were.
Oh, totally. And I imagine you can't also be presumptuous to think that the way that you have in mind will necessarily work with the ecosystem that you're working with, that you'd probably have to learn a lot about the ecosystem before making a recommendation or an implementation.
Yeah, for sure. One of the most famous phrases that you run into when doing international development is, it worked in Peru. If somebody says it worked in Peru, you can be pretty sure it's not going to work.
Can you give an example of something that you thought would be a solution, but you were disabused of that idea by listening in?
I probably could, but that would take some time.
That would take some time. Fair enough. Can you describe one of the developments that you were most content with having implemented in a particular country?
When we went to Zaire, when I went to Zaire in 1983, to a small town called Congolo, we were trying to get the farmers to grow more maize so they could sell it at a profit to the mining communities in the south of the country and in Katanga. Sorry, my phone keeps going off here.
Not a problem.
And we were able to work. I was not the only person working on this, of course. We were a very big team, agronomists and seed specialists and social scientists and engineers, road builders, everything. We're able to get exports from that part of the country from about 5,000 tons a year up to about 60,000 tons a year.
My goodness.
Which meant that the maize agriculture became so profitable that people were abandoning their poorly paid government jobs to go farm so that they could participate in this agricultural economy that was more profitable than government employment. So we're very proud of that. But of course, as you know, the Zaire came apart at the seams about 10 years later. And everything that we achieved there went almost completely down the tubes. The railroad, which the government itself had fixed up so they could get the maize from the north to the south, was redestroyed, and the supply chain to get the higher quality seeds and fertilizer into the farmers' hands was torn apart by the rebellion and the invasions from Uganda, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, where it was coming from. And the whole thing went to hell in a handbasket, as it were. And that was very disappointing after a very satisfying 3 years out there.
I imagine it was even heartbreaking to think these were people that you came to know and care about and saw them thriving, and to think that it was all taken away must have left you somewhat crestfallen.
very upset, very disappointed, but understanding that this was something that was entirely out of our control. Sure. I mean, when we lived in Sri Lanka with Andrea, whom you know, she was there with us.
Fabulous person.
The Tamil Tigers, who a number of European countries supported for some reason, massacred our villagers a couple of times. And that was more painful because it was while I was there, and it was people with whom we had worked to try to diversify their agriculture from rice to rice plus fruits and vegetables, mostly for economic reasons, but also for nutrition. And the tiger groups, Tamil Tigers, would come in and kill them for no particular reason except that they were on the frontier and they were trying to make a point that they should be given whatever it was they were asking for, which was sometimes hard to understand. So those were shockers.
And were you ever up close to violence of that kind?
I was never there when it happened, no, but as the team leader of the technical assistance group, I had to go visit the scenes soon after the attacks, and it was disconcerting.
I imagine, I hear a lot of understatement, disconcerting. I imagine it was potentially traumatizing for you to be up so close to death. Was it at all traumatizing, or?
Well, what would be the effect of a trauma? To get you to stop doing what you're doing? No.
Perhaps you'd be dreaming about it, or a little bit vigilant, more so than usual. Maybe
we were vigilant all the time, and no, I didn't have nightmares about it.
Yeah. So you were really well suited for this job,
or significantly insensitive, I suppose. That's what Andrea would probably say.
Yeah. Well, perhaps it was protective that you were, and that you were able to carry out your functions more readily than somebody who would be like me, for example. I would probably not have fared nearly as well. So your so-called insensitivity may have been a very powerful coping strategy for you to be able to be of service while you were there.
That's an interesting thought. Maybe, yeah, it could be.
Could be. Have you ever been fearful for your life? That you thought that? Have you been? I imagine you've been threatened here or there at some point.
Yeah, I've had people threaten me with guns, but I seem to have come through it okay. The most frightening moment I had was when, once again, going back to those 3 years in Zaire, when I was in Congola with this maize and roads project. If you wanted to drive from where we were to the capital city, it would take you about 3 weeks.
Oh my gosh.
Literally. But you could fly in 5 or 6 hours. So we would charter small flights to go back and forth whenever we had to go to the capital. And we were in a 2-engine Beechcraft at one point when both engines went out. And I suddenly realized how heavy the airplane was. Luckily, the pilot was a Portuguese veteran of the Angolan War, and he knew how to jumpstart engines in flight, and we were not far from an airport, so we got both engines flying again and landed, fixed the plane, and took off again the next day.
Unbelievable.
That scared the absolute devil out of me.
Yeah, I would think so. So, yeah, that sounds terrifying. You have 3 amazing kids, and did your tolerance for being in risky situations change after having children?
I don't think so. I don't think so. No, most of the time, for example, I think I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan.
I do.
That has all been after having children.
What was that like, living in Afghanistan?
It was always constrained. There were a lot of places you couldn't go, a lot of things you couldn't do, and things got worse and worse as the years went by. And in the end, we spent nearly all our time in the guest houses with full security. Although the first few years there, we could drive around and visit the villages with which we were working and talk to people in the field.
So
things have gotten much worse there over the years.
And were you there during the time of war?
No. Well, unless you count what's going on now.
Right.
But no, I was not there when the Russians were there. I was not there during the Civil War after the Russians left. I went for the first time, I think, in 2004.
Okay. Not exactly an easy time, just, yeah, but imagine there was some tension over there. Tell me about the relationships. I imagine you've met a lot of people who came to appreciate you, probably some people you came to really like in all of these countries that you visited and left. Even when I was doing some research on you, I saw a video from Indonesia where they were expressing appreciation to you with an homage. And I was just wondering, like, what's that like to have to leave a place?
It is always difficult when you've had a good relationship with the team and a good experience with the project. But as long as you feel like you're leaving things behind better than when you began, it's just the way this profession works.
And kind of to borrow from Thomas Wolfe, what's it like to go home after each of these really stimulating, exciting, purpose-filled, what's the word I want to use for this? Purpose-filled assignments.
Assignments, missions, yeah.
Yeah, what's it like to come back home after something like this?
Well, Andrea, my wife, whom you know, has always been a mixture of tolerant and intolerant of my absences. She's, we've stuck together through 34 years now of me traveling an awful lot. And what I remember most is when the kids were very small, and I would come home from a trip of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, whatever it was, when I was doing short-term work. They wouldn't talk to me until I opened my suitcase and they could see the toys I brought back.
And how about for you, though? Was it, I always think of that final scene. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Hurt Locker, where the IED diffuser comes back home and enters a supermarket, and you just really feel his sense of this has not got the same meaning that it did, the same intensity that he had over in Iraq. Was it like that for you in any way, just kind of coming back to around?
Supermarkets are classic. Andrea often would not let me go to a supermarket, depending on how long I'd been away, since I would simply want to buy one of everything in the supermarket.
So you had kind of an opposite experience. You would want to feed everything.
It all seemed like such cool stuff, 14 kinds of peanut butter. Might as well try them all.
I get it. Yeah. Can you tell us about the moments that you realized you were not in Kansas anymore? Just various times that you either were served something that you never imagined you would be served food-wise, or came across a custom that just rocked your world. Can you share either of those experiences?
Well, in the Peace Corps, Gabon was the country, where I lived in Gabon was the forest, the jungle. And they didn't have much in the way of animal husbandry. So finding protein was a big deal. Every once in a while, the French who were there would bring something in, and I would get a little bit of it. But basically, you need anything that moved. And so strange birds, reptiles, insects, you'd simply, whatever they were eating, you would eat. Your first crack at a palm grub is slightly disconcerting, but it turns out they're quite good.
How are they prepared? How is a grub prepared?
I don't know what you call it, sauteed or fried. They're very fat, so you sizzle them and they get crunchy. Caterpillars get crunchy.
Was there ever a time that you were served something? It sounds like you would just go with it when you were served, whatever it was.
I have yet to meet anything that my friends were eating that I wouldn't eat. I've been lucky that way.
Sure.
But I would hesitate if nobody else were eating
it. Fair enough. I unfortunately, when I landed in Korea, I had no money, and I was staying at a youth hostel of some kind, sharing a room with a German guy, and there were some. I decided to go out on my own and just go to a restaurant that was only inhabited by Koreans. I pointed on the menu, and everybody was laughing, and I was just kind of like, "Oh, this will be great." And what came back looked like, looked like Korean barbecue beef. And I put it on and I started eating it. And it was a meat that I'd never tried before. It had kind of a dirt-ish taste to it. And I didn't finish my portion. I didn't particularly like it. The next day, I was escorted there by my new Korean friend. I pointed at the menu at the item I'd ordered, and it was in fact dog. And I felt a lot of sadness and grief around that. But I'm imagining you've tried such things as, I believe, elephant and monkey at various times. Is that correct too?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. What was that even like? It tastes good, or?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on how you cook it, of course. They no longer recommend eating monkey because of Ebola and
For sure.
other transmissible diseases. But once again, if in places like Gabon in the forest, whatever, if it moves, you eat it, and you're either have protein or you don't have protein, and things. Because I'm an American and brought up on meat, I would eat whatever they put in front of me.
Yeah, you were very adaptive, and I think that's a crucial part of your story. If you were to estimate how many times your passport has been stamped in a different country, approximately how many countries have you stepped foot in?
Oh boy, I have no idea. 30, 40, 50, I have no idea.
Yeah, okay. And the one where you spent the most time was?
Total, most time probably Mauritania. I think we spent 7 years in Mauritania.
And what were some of the highlights of that?
About 2 years in the capital, trying to get authorization for an American NGO to get permission to work there, which we got finally, and set up a program there so that we would bring in international volunteers, not just Americans, but from any place, international volunteers, to take the place of Mauritanians who are on scholarship, learning some kind of skill abroad, so that the work could continue while they were gone. And I did that for 2 years, and then went for 5 years to a little town way off in the southeast called Stelababi, where we ran an integrated rural development project, working on agriculture, animal husbandry, range management, forest management, community development, whatever we could think of that would be helpful to them, since we were the only people down there.
And are there any customs that you've brought back with you? I see that there's a mask behind your head and various artisanal items from countries you visited. Any customs that you brought back that had an impact on you?
In Laos, I learned that everything tastes better when you eat it with a spoon. So I continue to eat most of my meals with a spoon as opposed to a fork. That's not very exotic, but that's one thing I learned.
Sure. And what's it like to travel with children? Because you've worked in various countries with your kids present.
The main burden of children overseas, when the husband is the main income earner, falls on the mother. And Andrea had to cope with being pregnant and having children while we were in Sri Lanka. Wow. And then with living with 3 small children while we were in Egypt. And she did it very bravely and well, and the kids seemed to have come out okay.
Yeah. Were you ever worried, or? It doesn't seem like you do worry. It doesn't seem like you worry much.
I worry all the time, but there were tense moments. I mean, one time when Ivan was quite young, he was playing with some friends, a little town in the bush where I lived, where Andrea was not visiting. The kids were there with me for a couple of days, just to give her a break. And he and a couple of other little boys who were there decided to try to jump over one of our tame village dogs. And when he jumped over the dog, he kicked the dog in the scrotum and was bitten. And we had to somehow get him rabies shots.
Oh my goodness!
Which he took very bravely. I mean, he was a tough kid right from the start. But that was a worrisome moment. And when Andrea was pregnant with Robin in Sri Lanka, she made the mistake of smiling at a monkey. And the old truism of just don't show your teeth to monkey.
Right.
The monkey, it was a pet monkey. It was not rabid, thank God, because she was pregnant, but she did get bitten. We had to keep the monkey under observation for 2 weeks, and the monkey was okay, so she was okay. We have no idea what a rabies shot would have done to Brahmin in utero.
Yeah, rabies shots are, to my knowledge, really violent things to get rid of something violent. So I'm guessing poor Ivan having that in his young system was just, wow.
He was very brave and tough, though. He was fearless and got them done. He was, as he is now.
He's
a good guy.
He's amazing. You're the son of Dr. Leon Goldensohn, who served as the chief psychiatrist at the Nuremberg trials. And I'm wondering, I'm seeing his path in going into something objectively terrifying and huge, epic in proportion. A great book has been written by, or at least compiled based on his notes by his brother, and Dan, your brother. I'm so glad that it exists. It's actually in my bookshelf in my office at all times. How did your father before you perhaps impact your psyche so that you would, I can't help but hypothesize that you did some of the things that you did partially inspired by your dad, Leon?
Well, I'm sure that's true, but you remember he died when I was 17.
Yeah.
And had been ill before that. And my memory of him when I was very young was that he would go to work before I got up in the morning and come home from work after I went to bed at night. And we had a bookshelf full of Holocaust survivor, what do you call them?
Testimonials or?
Yeah, mementos, books written about them.
Journals, diaries.
Journals, diaries, yeah. Because he intended to write a book about it, but he never got around to it. So luckily, his brother Eli, with help from my cousin Ellen Goldensohn and Danny, who had the notes stored away, got this book published. Robert Galately, the editor, did a great job. And it made me very proud of, he was quite a guy.
So you didn't get very much time with your father in the 17 years of your life. Was he? I guess I'm pulling for something even more because I find myself wondering if he was in any way, shape, or form an inspiration to you academically or with regard to taking on a big adventure.
Academically, for sure, and that he made sure I went to a first-class university. He himself had been accepted to Harvard, but had chosen for reasons of ideology to go to Ohio State. And I think he regretted it and wanted to be sure I got to go to a fancy school. So he made sure I went to Yale. And it was, I never had problems keeping up with the academic work. So I was never a great student, but I was a good student. And I'm not sure to what extent that came from him or from my mother, who was also a very intelligent and well-educated one. You never met her, I think.
No, I met Irene many times. I have a very great fondness for Irene. She gave me a long dissertation on having seen E.T. back in 1983 when it had just come out. She loved it. She gave it a 10. And she explained why she thought it was such an important movie, which was, to my 15-year-old self at the time, very, very beautiful. But yes, I got to see her many times.
That's nice. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it okay that I go? And I don't have to ask, but I am curious about the fact that you got married overseas in Laos. Is that territory we can touch or?
In Laos? No, I was married to Catherine, my first wife, while I was in Laos.
Oh, I thought you'd married a native somewhere.
In Zaire, yeah, traditional marriage and a traditional divorce.
Okay, so I'm gonna cut that part. But is it okay that I ask about it?
Yeah, sure. You can ask. I'm not sure how much I'll tell. But
so in Zaire, you got married to a local. What was that? What was the ceremony like? What was the whole experience like for you?
There's not really a ceremony. There's an exchange of gifts. I gave my future mother-in-law a duck and a big bowl full of rice and uncooked rice. And I think they gave me a chicken or something like that. And we started living together.
Mm.
And when I left, we split it up and I left her everything I had, a motorcycle and a lot of money, and left her, I think, happily divorced and ready to go on with her.
And a motorcycle in Africa, there's something very romantic about that idea of doing that. What was that? What was it like to just kind of roll around in such a foreign place?
This was a very small village in which we were living, and the nearest market was maybe 2 or 3 kilometers away, and it was easier to go on a motorcycle than it was to walk all the time.
Was it fun? Did you feel alive doing it? Was it exciting in any way?
Riding a motorcycle?
Yeah.
No more so than in other places. There are many of the assignments I've had out in the rural areas in the Congo or in Zaire or in Mauritania, in Sri Lanka. Most of the traveling I did was on a motorcycle, except when I had to go very long distances. It's just an easy way to get around and cheap and moderately safe.
And by being on a motorcycle, I know that you contracted malaria at one point. I imagine you might have fallen off the motorcycle at one point. I imagine being in third world countries where the likelihood of a fall or some type of injury required medical care. Did you require medical care in the countries you visited, and what was that experience like?
Well, when I lived in Mauritania, the hospital was staffed by doctors from mainland China. And we couldn't really talk to them, but we were friendly. And several times that I fell ill, they dealt with me with traditional Chinese medicine. They offered you a choice, Western or Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
I took Chinese every time, and it worked every time.
Wow.
They also did acupuncture very effectively for gastritis and toothache and things like that. And I had very good medical care from these Chinese doctors.
Do you continue to receive Chinese medicine?
No. I tried acupuncture for arthritis a couple of years ago, and it didn't do much good. And the doctor, who was Chinese, a woman, said that my arthritis was not susceptible to acupuncture, so we stopped.
Got it. And I'm just imagining you during non-COVID times at a cocktail party, meeting people for the first time, them, of course, asking you, so what do you do? What did you tell them?
I tell them I'm a consultant, which usually brings a glassy-eyed stare on a yawn, and they then leave me alone.
And that was your preference, I'm guessing?
Yeah, it's hard to talk about that. I don't mind talking about this stuff with you, Adam, because, we have a permanent and long-term relationship, but I don't talk about this very much with other people.
And can I just, out of curiosity, what is it about it that keeps you from talking about it?
Usually you have one of two reactions. One is horror at some of the stories, and the other is your eyes glazing over and interested only in, gee, what did you eat?
And even I asked that question.
Yeah, but you asked that question among 25 questions, all of which show that to me anyway, that you're trying to get out what was going on, and that's fair. But I can remember coming back from the Peace Corps, and my father was dead, but my mother having the party for all the relatives and everybody she could think of, and I was looking forward to telling stories about my adventures in Africa. And once they asked the question about what did you eat, then their eyes glazed over and they went back to talking about local politics and what was on the buffet. So, you get used to people. Very few people are interested in that. Used to be, I would sometimes meet during my single days, I would meet the women, and in the circles in which I traveled, if they said, "What do you do?" and I say, "Well, I work in Africa or in Asia," and they would say, "Well, what do you do there?" As soon as I talked about doing economic or political or social development, their eyes would glaze over because they were hoping that I was some kind of a Che Guevara revolutionary, and I wasn't. That's what they were hoping to be, and that wasn't me.
Totally not.
So I soon learned to deflect questions.
I'm taken by this phenomenon, Max. You had these rich 4K resolution experiences, all encompassing, deep, powerful. You come back.
4K, mean?
4K, I'm thinking about it like a 4K television. It's like it's the highest quality of a visual experience we can have. It's immersive. I mean, you were immersed in these countries doing things that somebody from Teaneck, New Jersey could never fathom. And to think that you were greeted with either, what did you eat? Which, by the way, I have been greeted with, and no more interest than that after my 3 years in Japan, and a very immersive experience, or perhaps horror. And for me, I'm just going to be straight up with you. I'm utterly amazed, compelled. I want to know more. I wish you could almost through a USB cable allow me to see the world that you saw while you were there, because it's to me it's actually magical. And I imagine that your kind of private, you become rather private about it, because why even bother trying to share it if I'm going to be met with A, B, or C response?
It's mostly indifference, and sure, that's all true.
But mostly indifference.
I don't have an answer to your question, but
is that consistent though with your reality? Like, I don't even want to even try to bother sharing this because perhaps the interest will not be there. Is that in me?
The interest won't be there, or somebody will have a contrary ideology, and it's hard to argue against people who have preset ideas about where you've been leading your life, and I'm going to argue with you about the ideas behind what you're doing when they have no idea what it was like on the ground.
But they read a book, so they know.
With them, right?
I'm sorry.
Most of the people with whom I enjoy spending time have lived lives similar to mine.
So they already are conversant they're conversant in that experience.
Yeah, it makes it easy to talk about it and to progress. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that actually may be one of the most profound components of anything we talk about today is the response. I remember getting off the plane after 6 weeks in Israel when I was just 17 years old. And the only question I got was, what was the food like? And nothing else. And people would say, tell me all about Japan. And I would start, and they would start telling me about how the Giants were playing. So I get it. And, just to normalize your experience, I was talking with the guy who swam, the equivalent of 75,000 miles, including the English Channel. He had an incredible story about swimming the English Channel. And even that, he could only get 4 lines in before people would change the subject.
Yeah, that's basically what goes on. But luckily, many of the people with whom I became close overseas, both Americans and others, have remained in touch, and I'm still able to have enough people to talk to and that can understand what I've been through, and I can understand what they've been through. So it makes for good friendships.
Wonderful. And I guess it might be a tough question to answer, but is there something that you might share or disclose with someone who has similar reference points that you haven't shared here during this talk?
I am not entirely sure. There might be, but I don't know.
Nothing that's conscious. Cool.
But you asked good questions, Adam. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Great, Mike. And I'm just going to close with this one, good man. You're now retired, and how do you feel about your career choice?
Oh, I'm very, very happy I did what I did. Unambiguous.
That's wonderful. And if somebody were to want to learn more about doing the kind of work that you were doing, how would they go about it? Where could they seek resources?
Oh, there are people who have my background teaching courses on development and on development work in most of the universities in the cities of the United States and in France and Britain. Courses in international development, courses in community development, courses in the history of development. And some of it becomes very academic and, to my mind, futile. But much of it is founded in real experience, and people will go ahead that way. There are also any number of NGOs working overseas where young people can get a start. They don't get paid very much, but they can get a start, get a taste for what it's like to do the headquarters support for this work, and then get sent overseas to try it themselves.
Awesome. And I apologize. This is actually the very last question. Since you've stepped foot in so many countries, what are some ways to enter a country gracefully as an outsider?
And make sure you have the right visa before you get there.
Okay, so that's logistic.
And just try to make sure that that you know what's going to happen the first couple of days after you arrive, that you know how to get from the airport to wherever it is you're going to stay, that the people who you're supposed to be meeting when you're there know when you're coming, and that why you're going to be there, and that they can prepare some documentation for you so you can read about what's going on and maybe read a book or two about the history of the place.
Perfect. Okay. Max, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your wisdom, and I just can't thank you enough for taking time.
Now, this has been a real pleasure, Adam. It's the most time you and I have ever spent together, and I've really enjoyed it. I hope we can meet in less formal circumstances and continue to develop whatever kind of friendship we should develop.
Max, I would love that. I've always held you in very high regard. So this has been something I've been looking forward to. And I would be very happy to hang out with you more.
Super. I'll look forward